Star Wars. Again? My second ever essay on this channel was on the sequel trilogy, and then I stopped caring about the franchise for a good while. I like the sequel trilogy on the whole, but it kind of salted the earth for anything interesting going forward, and it seemed like Lucasfilm knew that in launching the TV shows that were all set closer to Return of the Jedi or during the reign of the Empire. Andor was just one more of those shows retreading the Empire-era ground, until I actually watched it. Welcome back again to Left Below. Be a rebel and like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. And it's been a long time since my last essay. I took a 2-week vacation, then my computer broke, then I held a panel lecture at a convention, had to work on preparing that. But now we're back to our regularly scheduled over-analysis of media for children. Andor made me care about Star Wars again. But what brought me to this video was actually this meme. Although you can see several versions of this meme, because no idea is really new on the internet, all of these cropped up because of the need for Star Wars creatives to find survivors of Order 66 so that they could tell stories set during the Empire era without having those stories be completely free of good guy Force users. I think this meme in particular cropped up around the sequel to Jedi Fallen Order. This desperate search for Jedi, or for Jedi-likes, Padawans mostly, or the Guardians of the Whills in the case of Chirrut in Rogue One, makes sense. Force users are awesome, right? One of the intuitively coolest things in pop culture. But there seems to be an insistence on having them in Star Wars stories, even often those where they don't really fit. Chirrut sticks out like a sore thumb here, which could be forgiven because Rogue One was the first of the non-episode movies if you don't count the Clone Wars launch, which was really just a TV special in theaters. And with Rogue One and the many spin-offs that have followed it, Lucasfilm started to answer the question of what Star Wars is. So I'll start with that question. What is Star Wars? It was a movie that released in 1977. The end.
That didn't help at all.
Okay, well that movie in 77 could be broken down into 3 elements, seen from the characters on the Millennium Falcon throughout the film. Han and Chewbacca, Old Ben, Leia, and Luke. Each of them came from a different walk of life and represented a side of the galaxy that Lucas had created. Han and Chewbacca represent what I'll call the scoundrel side, being the pet name Leia throws at Han in Empire Strikes Back that's been taken up in the vocabulary of the fandom ever since. The scoundrel side of Star Wars focuses on the underbelly of the galaxy, and that part of Star Wars plays out a lot like gangster movies, or in a lot of cases cyberpunk, which itself often has a big gangster element. Old Ben, of course, represents the Jedi and the more mythic and spiritual side of Star Wars. The Force and its light and dark side bring in a mystical clash between good and evil that borrows from many different religious traditions. These rep the fantasy side of Star Wars. Leia comes from the wars side of Star Wars, the military-political side that can play out like a 70s spy thriller, or good old-fashioned war movies, or occasionally regular political drama, even though the fandom usually has low patience for those. Luke is the element that brings it all together while serving as the audience viewpoint, at least in the beginning. Especially in the first movie, he's not too much of any side or the other. For the scoundrel, he's a farm boy from a crime-infested distant planet, and even has parallels to Han's backstory in that he originally intended to join the Imperial Academy just for a chance to get away from his roots. He feels the Force, but is only given a hint of Jedi teachings before Obi-Wan dies. He signs up for the rebellion and turns out to be an ace fighter pilot and saves the day at the Battle of Yavin. The scoundrels on the fringes of society, war fighters and political actors, and Jedi and Sith together, and these make up the core Star Wars experience. You can see that balance between the different sides of Star Wars hold up in the original trilogy, though Luke's story moves entirely into the Jedi side of the Trinity by Episode 6. Return of the Jedi actually has all 3 elements running full blast, with the first act wrapping up loose ends from the scoundrel side of the story, the Battle of Endor being part infiltration and part grand war, and the spiritual clash between Luke, Darth Vader, and Emperor Palpatine. Everything in balance. 2 of the 3 parts of the Trinity coexist pretty well together, the scoundrel part and the wars part. A society's informal sector, which is the polite term for the black market that also covers more than just gangsters, often has a lot of overlap with the military when wartime comes around. An easy example in history are the privateers of the great age of piracy. Whether you were a pirate or a privateer just depended on who you were looting and whether you were in it for yourself or following a government's guidance on who to hit. In hard times like war and rebellion, the people who make a living on the fringes of society can find a new lease on life, just as Han Solo did, switch from smuggling drugs to smuggling troops and explosives into Andor. But the Jedi portion of Star Wars has always existed in tension with the other parts. I put the word problem in the video's title, and I talked a bit in the intro about how Force users in Star Wars have caused genuine creative problems in the franchise, but this problem exists in the text, too. Obi-Wan's sacrifice to become more powerful than you could possibly imagine begins the first hint of this. But the problem in-universe really kicks off with the Dagobah scenes in Episode 5. Wars not make one great, Yoda says, leading up to the time at Dagobah and ending with Luke storming off in a huff, refusing Obi-Wan and Yoda's urging to ignore his friends and focus on the greater good of fighting the dark side. Of course, the viewer is inclined to agree with Luke here, who wouldn't want to use these awesome powers they're learning to save their friends. It seems pretty simple to me. And this conflict carries in through all of the numbered episodes, starting with Palpatine trying to tug at Luke's affection for the rebellion at Andor to draw him towards the dark side. The prequel trilogy as a whole is like a meditation on this problem, and was the subject of a Princess Weeks video a few months back where she goes over how the Jedi's dogma kept Anakin emotionally stunted and unable to deal with the loss of his mother or his love for Padme. And also the super obvious question of just why didn't the Jedi save Shmi? In Episode 2, Yoda reflects on how the Jedi have become arrogant, and that's before many of them get drafted to be generals in a major war. While at the same time, he and Mace Windu remark that their ability to use the Force for insight has become diminished. Then in Episode 3, that comes to a head when Palpatine's scheming is finally revealed, and Yoda understands just how blind the Jedi have become. Palpatine's plan also puts the Jedi in an extremely compromising position in Episode 3. He begins to bring the Jedi under his direct control by trying to appoint Anakin to the Jedi Council as an observer. At the time, the Jedi are getting very skeptical of the Republic itself, seeing how thoroughly Palpatine has control of it even before they know he's a Sith. And when they do learn he's a Sith, they're quite willing to launch a coup against him, even though, evil as he was legitimately elected by the Republic senators. So sequel trilogy shows the Jedi, Luke, but he's all there is to start, taking the opposite extreme and separating themselves from worldly affairs after another predictable loop of, oops, my Padawan turned to the dark side and joined the fascists. Luke thinks, with some good reason, that the Jedi can't be involved in the galaxy's wars and politics. Leia agrees, just in the opposite direction, largely giving up her Force use in exchange for going all in on the Resistance and being an insurgent military leader.
Anakin, my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy!
I am going to end this, once and for all.
You can't. He must stand trial.
He has control of the Senate and the courts. He's too dangerous to be left alive.
And between these two takes, the viewer wants Obi-Wan's to be right, that the Jedi stand with democracy, but that's not really true. The Jedi Order is a religious order, and their interpretation of the Force has to come first in that sense. Their alliance with the Old Republic was a marriage of convenience, while the Republic kept the galaxy unified in a state of negative peace. That is, to coin a phrase from Martin Luther King, the absence of open conflict but without the presence of justice. This kind of hands-off peacekeeping fit with what the Jedi wanted, to keep the Force in balance and prevent the Sith from returning or gathering power again, but less interested in resolving the day-to-day injustices across the galaxy. See again, Shmi being left in slavery. A famously memeable scene in Episode 2 also addresses this, Anakin's troubling comments in favor of an authoritarian decision-maker who can force people to agree on the right thing, versus Padme's acknowledgement that democracy is messy because people don't always agree on what the right thing is. This is meant to be foreshadowing on how Anakin can justify joining the Empire, but also works as a debate between a clergyman and a liberal politician. The clergyman's view of the world is that there is an absolute right. And depending on their religion, there might not be an absolute wrong. Religions descended from the Middle East, as well as Hinduism, like to cast a great clash of light and dark, while other religions present like a single righteous path with many ways to screw it up. Islam actually does both. But major religions agree that there is a single sublime truth out there, and that it has been revealed through prophets, gurus, divinely inspired texts, and the like. And any ambiguity just comes from interpreting these instructions. Padme presents the liberals' view, and that's liberal with a small L here, believing in like democracy, freedom of speech, inclusion more broadly. Her view throws all of these absolutes out the window. In the democratic political world, ideals are just guide rails pointing people to what they want, and then they do the messy work of finding people with similar ideals, forming parties, cutting deals with other factions, and then passing and enacting laws. In her sphere, the presence or absence of a single truth doesn't really matter. Only the wants of people and their representatives do. So with all that said, I want to change tacks and talk about Andor. Andor is a Star Wars show that cuts the Jedi and the Force entirely out of it, and focuses jointly on the scoundrel and wars pillars of Star Wars. This excellent video I found while researching this script says as much. That it does make a major cut from the formula, but does it in a way that still keeps the Star Wars spirit. And that's from how good of a job Andor does giving flavor and context to the fight that started it all in the original trilogy, even better than the Rogue One film that this show is meant to lead into. So here's a quick run through for folks who might not have seen Andor yet, so spoiler warning in 3, 2... Cassian Andor is introduced in Rogue One as a committed rebel intelligence officer who's struggling over whether sacrificing people for the greater good of the rebellion is right or not. The first season of his self-titled show explains how he goes from a two-bit scoundrel who's also searching for his long-lost sister to someone who cares about the Empire and resistance against it. It starts with his search for his sister going wrong as he runs afoul of 2 Rent-A-Cops and kills them in the ensuing struggle, which leads the Premor Corporation, operating under license from the Galactic Empire, to investigate Andor's home planet of Ferrix. Andor knows the heat is on, so he tries to move some stolen Imperial equipment to a buyer contacted via his ex-girlfriend, so he can get the money needed to skip town. That deal is intercepted by the Premor cops. Then Andor and that contact manage to get away and kill several Premor agents in the process, drawing Imperial attention. The contact is Luthen, a supplier, spy, and information broker for the nascent rebellion, who ropes Andor into a big job at the Imperial military base on Aldhani, where the Empire stores payroll credits for their operations. He gets thrown in as a last-minute addition to a rebel cell, and they pull off their heist, albeit with sacrifices. Andor gets his cut and blows town to the resort planet of Neamos, where he gets picked up by the authorities for, literally no reason. Normally, he'd have gotten a light sentence for this trumped-up charge on the order of months, but the Aldhani heist made the Empire crack down, and so he gets sent to a prison factory on Narkina 5 for a 6-year sentence. While he's stuck there, the Empire tightens its grip on his homeworld of Ferrix and puts the locals through a lot, including terrifying torture. He gains the confidence of his fellow inmates, and after the prisoners manage to learn that they're never going to actually be released, no matter what their prison sentence term says, they revolt and manage a prison break. Andor gets off-planet back to Neamos to get his money, then goes back to Ferrix for the finale, as his adopted mother Marva has recently passed away. Marva's testament, played at her funeral procession for a crowd of the locals, inspires a general uprising. Andor manages to get some of his closest friends off-planet, but leaves separately to go join the rebellion. So again, this show illustrates the interaction between the scoundrel and the wars side of things. Andor wasn't in it for the rebellion initially. He just liked ripping off the Empire because they were an easy target, and he needed money to get himself off-world after the inciting incident with those Premor agents. He's thrown into the Aldhani job, and the people there ran the gamut of who wants to be an insurgent. There's Gorn and Terriman, one a current Imperial officer serving as a mole and the other an ex-Imperial stormtrooper, both of whom had become disillusioned with the Empire for different reasons. Vel and Cinta, dedicated veteran partisans with ties to rebel leadership. Skeen, who saw his life as me against everybody else. And Karis Nemik, a young idealist writing a manifesto on the rebellion. Joined by Andor himself, who had experience in ripping off Imperials but less particular interest in the cause. The diversity in the Aldhani heist crew, in terms of their life stories and their motives for becoming rebel actors in the first place, extends to other members of the key cast. You have the Resistance ringleader Luthen Rael, who's an unapologetic accelerationist, willing to make things worse for the people of the galaxy in the short term if it means building more support for the rebellion. Mon Mothma comes from the Imperial Senate and remembers the Old Republic and wants to restore its ideals, and is conflicted over the collateral damage a rebellion might cause. The delightful Saw Gerrera represents the extreme, both in his ideals and his practices. Gerrera is an anarchist and sees his fight as one to bring down oppressive systems as a whole, scoffing at the idea of restoring the Republic. He also is extremely difficult to work with, extremely paranoid, nearly as much a danger to his allies as to the Imperial enemy. With him, you get the impression of someone who will fight any group that says they're in charge or want to be in charge. Andor's adoptive mother Marva fills another niche. She and her husband started much like Andor himself, ripping off the Republic Army during the Clone Wars. But her husband getting executed during the transition from Republic to Empire turned her heart against the Empire. Her cause for rebellion was deeply personal and tied to the love of her family and community. The Imperial side of things shows off more junior officers, fixing in especially on the KGB-esque Imperial Security Bureau and mid-level supervisor Dedra Meero, along with low-ranking corporate security officer Cyril Karn, who quickly gets canned after the Ferrix fiasco I mentioned in the synopsis. A handful of other officers are shown fleetingly, a torture technician, occupation officers, among others. Fittingly for a dictatorship like the Galactic Empire, the individuals working for them matter a little less than their spot in the machine and how they reinforce Imperial authority. The show does a great job of showing the kinds of people who thrive under a dictatorship. Dedra Meero and Cyril Karn stand out as being outwardly enthusiastic about the Empire, and not just interested in their own place in the machine. Karn's even willing to risk his neck numerous times for a chance to enforce the law. The excellent YouTuber Andrewism did a video on the psychology of authoritarianism that goes along with a lot of what Andor was laying down. He points to a personality type that tends to be an enthusiastic follower for dictators and strongmen, not out of belief that they can be the one in charge, but out of a strong sense that society needs to be kept in line with a heavy hand. Karn and Meero want to be the boot. Others are more selfish, liking the Empire for the chance it gives them to have personal power, or just to hurt other people like the terrifying Dr. Gorst. The show does a good job of showing the Empire's evil as systematic, a massive bureaucracy of evil that reinforces itself through every avenue of society. Even though it does have people who genuinely believe in it, like Meero and Karn, the problem is not them so much as the system that gives them the power to hurt others, regardless of their personal reasons for doing so. Notice something missing from this Star Wars story about how the Empire and resistance to it runs through so many different people in so many different walks of life? It's the Jedi and Sith. It's notable that Vader and Palpatine are completely absent from the story. The depth of the Empire again shows that the machine Palpatine created was capable of doing plenty of evil on a personal level, compared to blowing up Alderaan, which is grandiose but a bit less relatable. And the people in the Empire didn't need the dark side of the Force to motivate them. For similar reasons, this show ignores the various Jedi survivors that it could have brought on board, but that also really helps its themes and story to shine. The absence of the Jedi in Andor really works, because of the problem with Jedi that I mentioned earlier and is the main thesis of this video. How do you reconcile spiritual, absolute morality with the messy work of war and politics and social change? This question would get in the way of the questions that Andor wants to ask. What does it take to be a violent rebel? What is the correct moral conduct when you're in a life-and-death struggle with an evil dictatorship? Especially one that will take full advantage of any leverage, any weakness that they can find in you and your allies. Even outside of religions, different philosophers have struggled with this question. Immanuel Kant, with his categorical imperative, would say that any action is immoral if that action is incorrect some of the time. The infamous example you see on Reddit a lot is a meme of a man cheerfully telling a murderer at his front door that the murderer's target is hiding inside because lying is wrong sometimes. He would be against the idea that you could do good if you did any evil along the way. The ends do not justify the means. Albert Camus reflects on this in The Rebel, in talking about where acts of rebellion can cross the line from good to evil, and he lands on the idea that it becomes wrong when you go from opposing oppression to trying to impose your ideals on others. He reflects on the violent revolutionaries in Russia, fighting the czars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he speaks favorably of the earlier assassins, the 19th century ones, who willingly faced death and execution for their actions, contrasting them with Lenin and Stalin and the Bolsheviks and their secret police, who tried to justify their violence as part of their new moral order. Camus' thoughts would gel with Luthen's monologue to Lonnie Jung in the episode One Way Out. Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I've made my mind a sunless place. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, they've set me on a path from which there is no escape. I yearned to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I looked down, there was no longer any ground beneath my feet. Luthen fully understands the moral sacrifice he's making, that he's lost all claim to righteousness in doing whatever it takes to destroy tyranny. It's a depth of moral complexity that's excellent for any TV, let alone a Star Wars show. Luthen understands that what he's doing is wrong and will hurt people, but also that it must be done. The greater good does not justify individual evils, but those individual evils also don't mean that the rebellion is not essential. Luthen is very clear-eyed about what violent rebellion is, and what it demands of the rebels themselves. Other rebels aren't nearly as clear-eyed, fighting for greed, different ideals, personal ideals, or because they have nothing left but to fight. But regardless of the motives, they are all doing a net good, even with a lot of mess along the way. And that kind of practical desperation doesn't fit in with the big-picture spirituality of the Jedi. This was a story that could only be told by dropping the Force from Star Wars. Of course, plenty of Star Wars media is also missing the Jedi, but it's usually more like the video games, sometimes the books, so rarely the films and TV. Like I said earlier, even Solo and Rogue One got Force user elements shoehorned in, but the only hint in Andor is the Kuwati Kyber crystal that Luthen gives to Cassian, being a component used in lightsabers. Adding a Force user element to Andor would have changed large parts of the story and theme, would have forced some direction in the perfectly muddy moral ambiguity that the show pulls, but it also benefits the Jedi to not have them in every Star Wars story. When Jedi are in stories that aren't specifically about them, the need to balance the three parts of the Star Wars Trinity means you lose out in how complex you can make each part of the Trinity. Without needing to desperately put Jedi everywhere, Jedi stories can benefit too. Looking forward, that kind of diversity in storytelling in Star Wars will give writers a chance to unwind the problem that the entire Skywalker saga posed, the question of light and dark and the too strict requirements imposed on the Jedi. And yeah, I loved Star Wars KOTOR 2 like the rest of us, but miss me with that gray Jedi stuff. It doesn't work thematically with what Lucas very clearly intended the Force to be. But you could go for some of that good deep cut stuff like the Aang Ti monks of the old Legacy canon, who envisioned the Force as a rainbow of color and not as a rigid binary. Wherever they go from here, I hope Lucasfilm takes the strong reception and success of Andor to heart, and diversifies the types of stories Star Wars can tell. Thank you all for watching, and remember there's a real-life struggle going on for the creative workers behind Andor. The link here will show you how you can help make sure that they get a fair reward for their work. Because that brilliant Luthen monologue didn't write, perform, and film itself,